I build a chapel.
I build the chapel.
You build a chapel.
You build the chapel.
At least me, anyway. I love me some fried chicken.
I live on the streets. You sit on a throne. So yeah, my world is way more blacker than yours.
Films have the ability to teach us something about the human condition. In June 2020, in response to the Black Lives Matter movement, the ongoing police atrocities that have shaped America in recent years, and the protests after the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and countless others, The Help became one of the most streamed films on Netflix. Its popular rise also saw backlash against it. And this long overdue rush to acknowledge America's deeply entrenched anti-blackness, white people's perspectives have remained prioritized. During this reflection on blackness in media, we must focus on the complexity and brilliance of black film on its own merits, not cater to those who need to see race through a more simple lens. So let's talk about white saviors in film history. So what is the white savior narrative? It's when the white character, who's mainly the protagonist, acts to help non-white people, but can be perceived as self-serving. Even when the plot is centered by those people of color, their white counterparts typically take center stage. Throughout film history, we've been introduced to this cliche, and there are commonalities in the main characters. They're often characterized as confident and determined souls, risking their own image in a discriminatory and privileged society to help a person of color. We see this very trope from films produced decades ago, from period adaptations to films about modern times. These characters stand up for who they are helping, and in turn for themselves. They're the main guys in charge, the ones in control. Even though the larger story is about the oppression of people of color, they're often sidelined by their more potent, more privileged liberator. I have to mention Kipling's White Man's Burden.
It was a poem written in 1899, addressed to the US. For a large part of the 19th century, America's long-standing reluctance to become involved in European alliances and wars, or their isolationist policy, changed after seizing total Spanish control in Cuba. They drove the Spanish out and took Cuba's independence from them, along with Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines.
Now, in response to this, Kipling, in his own unique British and Indian experience, wrote that imperialist powers had a responsibility for educating and civilizing those native powers it now controlled. Make of this as what you will. I'm not here to talk about the Jungle Book, but White Man's Burden replicated a shared opinion in those times. What might have been intended as guiding or to serve is largely based on an excuse to steal and exploit lands and resources while hiding under the blanket of religious unity and fairness.
The responsibility of these imperialists used their powers to rape, pillage, and murder entire civilizations globally.
But Kipling prioritizes the struggle white imperialists face. Do you see why this is problematic? So that leaves us here. We all know that too often those in privilege define the boundaries of morality without taking into account the decidedly different experiences of those who've been subjugated or marginalized or worse. The white savior trope really took off during the 50s and 60s, namely due to the rise of the American civil rights movement. While protests were being held, mainstream cinema focused on channeling these ideas through the white men dealing with these new tensions. It created a notion that would stand even now, that white audiences can't relate to these issues unless the story is being told through a white character's view. Studios were comfortable in producing these films, and it's a trend that lives on today. Let's take a look at Lilies of the Field. Now, this is no dig at the master that is Sidney Poitier. His filmography is mostly made of films in which blackness is not in service to whiteness. In his films, the black characters are often driving the story and aren't usually helped by their white counterparts. In fact, Poitier is often the one assisting the white characters, such as To Sir with Love, a subversion of the inner city teacher trope in which Poitier is teaching the disaffected white London youth, and especially in the heat of the night, in which Poitier essentially solves a murder by himself, while the white police simply tag along, and they're pissed he's good at his job. While these roles changed the game for black artists and set Poitier as a prominent leading actor, the Academy seemed to strategically avoid awarding Poitier an Oscar until 1963's Lilies of the Field. Now in that film, Poitier was in the rare position of being in a subservient role to whiteness, and it's very ironic that this film was the one the Academy felt was worthy enough for an award. Poitier plays Homer, a drifter who happens upon a group of nuns in the Arizona desert. They think he was sent by God to help them build their church. It's through the building of the church that Homer becomes tamed in a way by the white nuns. He becomes more involved in constructing the church, and eventually he works knowing he won't be paid. He just wants to make sure the nuns are taken care of. Through building the church, Homer finds purpose and meaning, something he apparently lacked before in the film. It's so strange that out of all of Poitier's amazing work, this film was awarded by them. In To Kill a Mockingbird, like the novel, its film adaptation is a classic. Atticus Finch, who's a lawyer in a small Alabama town who takes on the case of a black man, Tom Robinson, who was wrongly accused of raping a white girl. Now, I'm not saying this film should be shunned and never to be seen again. For its time, it shone a light on racial prejudice, injustices, and innocence being destroyed by evil. For Harper Lee, this book was immense for her, but race was not her main focus in her records. Their interactions with the black community are one part of the story, but white society is the subject of the book. It talks about their culture, their conflicts among themselves, and about a white girl growing up within it. It was about the white middle class and what their place was in the world of literature. The film's success led studios to produce more films about black history, but told through the resilient white protagonists they focused on. When it comes to period films, I narrowed it down to these two: The Help and Green Book. I could have picked more, but these two are extremely popular, and I know why they appeal to people. Green Book tells a story about a classical pianist and a no-nonsense gangster taking a road trip where they make the unlikeliest of friendships. The pair encounter racism during the trip, ranging from casual remarks to violent hostility from civilians and the police. While it comments on racism in the Jim Crow South, the focus is more on the making of the white guy a better person. On the subject of the film, Shirley's family called the film inaccurate, and even Nick Vallelongo wrote this film without consulting them first. It's bewilderingly condescending for this film to be a dramedy that lacks so much of the complexity of the issues of racism, and not even stay true to a main character that actually experienced it. And yet, curiously, the actual Green Book itself doesn't play much of a role in the film. Back then, segregation was heavily in place. Unlike free-roaming white Americans, black families would not have been accepted in the motels, restaurants, and salons around the country. But in the 30s, a book that was published till 1964 was written to inform black families on where they would be accepted. And the film rarely mentions this important aspect. The Help is a period film about an author who wants to write about black domestic workers, shining a light on their experiences. That's right, a film exploring racial tensions, whose protagonists are not the domestic workers, but the white author who wants to highlight the lives of those characters in the film. Why can't this same topic be explored by those who have first-hand experiences of the atrocities that they go through? The film aims to be a feel-good film. It tells us to be nicer to racial minorities. Take a look at Madeline Anderson's film. She was the first African-American documentarian, and she filmed 400 underpaid black women who went on strike to demand union recognition in 1970's I Am Somebody.
We as black people in South Carolina have awakened to the fact that we are no longer afraid of the white man, and that we want to be recognized, not because of our race.
But The Help is more interested in choosing to tell a story where the white protagonist fights for the minority and oversimplifies that. As in, if it weren't for Emma Stone's character Skeeter, whose need to write a book on behalf of these women, even though these women did not ask, that the same domestic workers would not have fought for themselves during the struggle for racial equality. This is why I prefer Roma. Like The Help, it tells a story of an indigenous domestic worker in Mexico. She's loved by the family she works for. But the film does not discount the systemic and unequal treatments of a privileged white family and an indigenous domestic worker. It's a well-grounded piece that highlights the complexities of everyday life, mainly through the eyes of someone who's underprivileged, and the subtlety of the power dynamic shaped by those higher up.
¿Qué haces? Ya dime.
No puedo, estoy muerta.
You would think that the current state of affairs would change how we tell these complex issues. It's still very much alive today. Just like the films I mentioned earlier, films like Blind Side often portray their black and POC characters as passive in their own stories. In Blind Side, the matriarch of an affluent Southern family takes the decision to provide for a homeless black teenager. The film uses techniques to fit their narrative. Like The Help, our main character Leanne interacts with her friends, who behave awfully, but in comparison, we sympathize with Leanne. The teenager, Michael, is often quiet. He rarely shares his experiences in the film, but his purpose is just to be thankful for a white family that rescued him. The film doesn't comment on broken families or systemic restrictions. It only reduces systemic issues and societal shortcomings to individual virtue. This strange narrative that the emphasis on white protagonists and their light experiences with racism almost equates their experiences to the characters that face harsher realities. That's the issue with films like these, that even though the plot is driven by racial issues, black narratives are drowned out by whiteness. Again, I'm seeing these well-intentioned pieces give their white protagonists complex storylines and character development, and their often sidelined non-white characters get reduced to just their negative experiences. There's no denying that the films I've mentioned share a sheer ubiquity that detracts from other stories grounded in black perspective. There's no denying that the films I've mentioned are mainly made and produced by white writers and directors, narrowing down how much perspective and creativity comes from artists of the very same field, and yet no diversity is shown. There's no denying that the same films I've mentioned are typically picked for award shows, representing the year's very best, when clearly every year there's a clear argument being made that the cyclical picking rejects films that truly say something about ourselves, but instead focus on promoting the same bland storytelling, and out-of-touch films that we get every year. These are made to tell a simpler story, a happy ending that leaves you satisfied and not questioning the complex issues of racism in our society. Issues of systemic racism are not solved at the end of a 2-hour film. But now more than ever, we should return to black narratives that decenter whiteness or ignore it altogether. Films that connect audiences with the pathos, joy, and even treachery of black characters and lives they depict. The films that recognize their complex humanity.
My black is and black ain't. Black is and black ain't. Black is blue and black is red. And black is a tank.
Black will get you.
And black is light.
And black will leave you alone. Black can get you over. And black can set you down.